The year was 1846, and winter had come early to Blackwood County, Virginia, a cold so heavy it didn't just cling to windows, it seemed to settle into the bones of the earth. Frost glittered across the hills like glass dust, and smoke from chimneys hung low, refusing to rise. And at the heart of that frozen quiet stood the Harrington estate, 600 acres of wealth, symmetry, and silence. From a distance, it looked like perfection itself, the kind of place that could have been painted on the side of a porcelain plate. A white-columned Georgian mansion. Fences straight as scripture. Fields laid out with the precision of a general's plan. But locals used to say there was something off about that silence. That laughter never seemed to echo right there. That when music played from the porch, it stopped too soon, as if the air itself refused to carry it. Even the birds, people whispered, flew around the Harrington property, never over it. To the town, Thomas Harrington was a picture of refinement, the sort of man who tipped his hat to strangers and whose name carried weight in courthouse meetings. He'd made his fortune in tobacco and cotton, and his wealth bought him not just land, but respect. And yet, for all his success, the real story, the one people didn't dare say aloud, began with his wife, Elizabeth Harrington. Her presence could silence a room faster than a storm could empty a street. She was known for her posture, her quiet grace, her calm voice that could freeze a servant mid-step. Parish newsletters praised her generosity. Her tea parties were attended by the county's most respectable families. And yet, when the help spoke of her, they did so in hushed tones, careful not to use her name after dark. The Harrington estate was run like a clock, and Elizabeth was its ticking heart. Every door closed at a certain hour. Every task had its time. Every person their place. But if you looked at the estate's records, the old ledgers that gathered dust in county offices, something strange appeared. The Harringtons reported almost 3 times as many enslaved women of childbearing age as any other plantation nearby. No one questioned it then. Why would they? Wealth excused curiosity. And yet, the numbers didn't make sense. There wasn't enough land for that many laborers. No new fields had been planted, no tobacco barns expanded. Still, Elizabeth kept buying. When neighbors joked that the Harringtons were good breeders, they meant livestock. But there were whispers, soft ones, that the same might be true for the humans who lived behind those locked quarters at the edge of the fields. And if you stood there at night, by the tree line where the fence bent low, some said you could see faint light flickering from a long, narrow building behind the garden. A building with shuttered windows and doors that locked from the outside. They called it the women's quarter. And no one asked what went on inside. Because in the South, silence was safety. And in that silence, something monstrous had already begun to grow. If the Harrington estate was a machine, then Elizabeth Harrington was its ticking clock, precise, cold, and endlessly predictable. Every day began at 5:30 sharp, whether the sky bled with sunrise or sagged under rain. The first bell meant the housemaids rose. The second, breakfast for the family. The third was a warning. Anyone not at their post by then didn't stay past noon. Her husband, Thomas, may have owned the land, but everyone, from the stable boy to the cook, knew who ran it. Elizabeth's word was law. Her schedule didn't just manage the house. It controlled it, like a pulse keeping the chaos of life from spilling in. Mondays were for linens. Tuesdays, for floors. Wednesdays, for brass and silver. The days folded into each other with the same tidy precision as her pressed collars. She didn't permit idleness. She didn't permit laughter. And she most certainly didn't permit noise. Noise breeds chaos, she once told a maid. And chaos invites sin. The servants learned quickly. The safest sound in Harrington House was none at all. But Elizabeth's obsession with order didn't end at the threshold of her home. Beyond the manicured gardens, just past the edge of the orchard, stood a new building. She oversaw its construction herself, from the first brick to the final lock. It was called the women's quarter. Unlike the rough-hewn cabins found on other plantations, this one was different, unervingly so. Separate rooms. Sturdy walls. Windows narrow and high, too small for anyone to climb through. And each door locked, from the outside. To visiting neighbors, it looked almost modern, advanced even. When asked why she'd built it that way, Elizabeth would smile, that perfect, unbothered smile, and say, "A woman must have order in all things, even among her servants. But the records, and the whispers, tell another story. Between 1840 and 1846, Elizabeth purchased nearly twice as many young women as before, most of them between the ages of 14 and 20, bought from markets in Georgia and South Carolina. Yet, strangely, tobacco production never increased. The fields stayed the same. The ledgers showed no new acres cultivated. So why bring in so many women when there was no work for them to do? The answer wasn't in the crops. It was in Elizabeth's journals, small leather-bound books she kept locked in her study. The entries weren't prayers or household accounts. They were lists, names, ages, physical measurements, notes written in neat, slanted handwriting. And when one housemaid accidentally saw those pages, she was dismissed the same day. No one ever saw her again. To the outside world, Elizabeth Harrington was a beacon of grace, hosting tea for pastors, organizing charity drives, lecturing young wives on virtue. But behind closed doors, her sense of duty had curdled into something mechanical, something almost scientific. Every ritual, every silence, every lock, it all served a purpose. And that purpose was about to take form. Because that same winter, a stranger was on his way to the Harrington estate. A doctor. And his arrival would mark the beginning of something far darker than order. By the fall of 1846, the strange new building behind the Harrington mansion was no longer a curiosity. It had become a quiet fact of life, something everyone in Blackwood County knew about, but no one dared to mention. The locals called it the women's quarter, though few had ever seen it up close. To the casual eye, it looked tidy, symmetrical, well-built, another testament to Elizabeth Harrington's obsession with perfection. But those who worked the land knew better. They'd heard the locks click at dusk. They'd seen the lamps flicker through the cracks of the shutters long after midnight. And every so often, they'd catch a sound, faint, quick, stifled, like someone trying very hard not to cry. No one spoke of it openly. Not in the market, not in church, not even in whispers. The South had a way of burying its horrors under manners and hymns. But inside those locked rooms, Elizabeth's order had taken on a new shape. Each room in the women's quarter was identical, a narrow bed, a stool, a small basin. No mirrors. No windows that opened. Every door locked from the outside with a heavy iron latch. The women were not allowed to speak after dark. They were monitored, measured, and recorded, not by overseers, but by Elizabeth herself. Her handwriting filled ledger after ledger. Subject 1, strong. Subject 2, uncooperative. Subject 3, suitable for further observation. She didn't use their names. Only numbers. No one in the household could explain what she was doing, not even her husband, Thomas. He was often away, on business, he'd say, and when he returned, he seemed careful not to ask questions. And so, Elizabeth's small empire of silence grew unchecked. Neighbors noticed, of course. They always do. But they told themselves polite stories to keep the unease away. She was reforming her servants, perhaps. Or providing quarters for delicate workers. Nothing unseemly. Nothing to stain a lady's reputation. After all, Elizabeth Harrington was a lady, the kind whose charity dinners filled church coffers and whose prayers could hush a room. Yet the ledgers told another truth. Between 1840 and 1846, she had purchased more than 30 young women. The estate's productivity hadn't changed. The tobacco barns stood half empty. But the number of births among the enslaved population, quietly noted in county records, had begun to rise. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Then it didn't. By the end of 1846, rumors began to spread that Elizabeth's obsession wasn't with crops at all, but with the bodies of the women she owned. That she wasn't managing a household, but conducting an experiment. And as the nights grew longer, a stranger arrived at the estate. His carriage rolled up the drive under cover of darkness, curtains drawn tight. He was not a preacher, not a merchant, not a guest. He was a doctor. And whatever he came to treat, it wasn't an illness anyone could name. Autumn of 1846 arrived quietly, its chill settling over the Harrington estate like a warning no one could hear. The field stood empty, the frost came early, and the days shortened into long, candlelit evenings. That was when the carriage first appeared. It came just after sundown, dark green, unmarked, its curtains drawn tight. The driver didn't stop in town. He rode straight up the long gravel road, the sound of the wheels swallowed by mist. When it halted before the mansion's front steps, a tall man stepped out, coat buttoned to the throat, hat brim low. His name was Dr. William Farnsworth, a physician from Charlottesville. To the locals, he was a mystery. There'd been no talk of illness at the estate, no epidemic sweeping through the servants' quarters, no word of injury or birth. So what was a doctor doing there? And why did he keep coming back? In those days, a physician's visit rarely lasted more than an hour. But Farnsworth stayed overnight. 3 times that autumn, he arrived after dark and left before sunrise. His carriage curtains never opened. No one saw him dine with the family. No one saw him leave the house at all. Whatever he was tending to, it was being kept secret. Years later, when his personal papers were unearthed, one letter stood out. It was addressed to a colleague in Philadelphia. His handwriting was neat, but the tone was trembling. I have been called to attend to a situation at H Estate which I find increasingly difficult to reconcile with my professional ethics. I fear that what I have witnessed cannot be explained within the boundaries of medicine alone. He never described what he saw, but his account books filled in the silence. Among the purchases he logged during those visits were bottles of laudanum, ergot, and tonics labeled for female complaints. Medicines that, in the wrong hands, could be used to induce or prevent pregnancy. And that same winter, the county's birth ledgers began to shift. Between October 1846 and March 1847, the number of births among the Harrington estate's enslaved women nearly doubled. 11 births in one season, an impossible figure for a single property of its size. No fathers were listed. No explanations given. Just numbers. Some historians would later argue that Farnsworth believed he was conducting medical examinations, perhaps even helping women in distress. Others believe he knew exactly what was happening, and that what he saw inside those shuttered rooms began to break him. His final visit came in December. After that, his name disappeared from every county record. No correspondence. No trace. But one thing did appear, written in Elizabeth Harrington's calm, immaculate hand. A purchase order for more medical supplies than any household could possibly need: morphine, linen bandages, iron tonics. To her, it was just bookkeeping. To history, it was something else. The moment a doctor's silence became complicity. Because in the dead of that Virginia winter, Elizabeth Harrington wasn't just maintaining order. She was manufacturing it, one life at a time. The winter of 1846 was unlike any other in Virginia's memory. The frost didn't just settle, it stayed, sealing the fields under a hard, glassy silence. The roads to the Harrington estate vanished under snow, and for months, no one went in or out. From a distance, the mansion looked peaceful, almost holy beneath its blanket of white. But peace has a way of disguising horror. Behind those shuttered windows, life was being forced into existence. When the snow finally melted, county ledgers recorded something astonishing. Between March and May of 1847, 11 children were born to 9 enslaved women on the Harrington property. 11 births. In a single spring. No recorded fathers. No medical reports. No explanations. To the county clerk, it was just ink on paper. To history, it was the first proof that something unthinkable had happened behind those walls. Neighbors remembered the sounds that winter, faint cries carried across the wind. Not the usual cries of childbirth, but overlapping wails, muffled and desperate. It sounded, one old farmer later told his grandson, like a nursery where no one ever sang. Inside the mansion, Elizabeth Harrington ran her household with the same chilling precision as always. Every birth was logged. Every infant weighed. Every woman assigned a number, never a name. Her husband, Thomas, conveniently, was gone. Church records show he'd left that autumn on extended business. Whether he knew what his wife was doing, no one could ever prove. But his absence was suspiciously timed. Elizabeth kept her ledgers meticulously. Each week, she sent for new shipments: chloroform, opiates, bandages, tinctures labeled for the women. Her handwriting remained calm, elegant, like a banker balancing books, not a woman documenting lives. In her mind, this wasn't cruelty. It was management. She saw herself as improving her husband's fortune, turning motherhood into profit. In her world, children weren't born. They were produced. And as those 11 infants came into the world, another kind of silence fell over the estate. For every new child, a woman vanished from the records, listed as transferred or moved. Yet no bills of sale were ever found. No one knew where they went. By the time spring thawed the ground, the air around the mansion felt heavier, wrong. The staff avoided the east wing altogether. The overseer resigned without explanation, muttering only, "There are things a man shouldn't have to hear." But outside, the community still praised Elizabeth. The church bulletin called her a pillar of virtue. She continued to host luncheons, donate to orphanages, and lead Sunday. The following winter brought no celebrations to the Harrington estate. No Christmas parties, no choir music drifting through the fields, just stillness. That heavy, watchful stillness that made even the wind seem cautious. By December of 1847, people in Blackwood County had started to notice. The chimneys smoked at odd hours. The shutters on the east wing stayed closed, even in daylight. The grand house, once a symbol of Southern grace, had turned inward, as if it was holding its breath. Then came the night after Christmas. The first flames were seen just after midnight, a dull orange glow behind the east wing. Neighbors rushed from their homes, trudging through the snow with buckets and lanterns. But by the time they reached the hill, it was too late. The fire had already devoured the oldest part of the house. Strangely, the blaze didn't spread. It was as if the fire knew exactly what it meant to consume. The official report listed no deaths. But by morning, Elizabeth Harrington was gone. Her husband, Thomas, offered no explanation. He simply packed up what remained of the family, their 2 daughters, Margaret and Eleanor, and left for Richmond within weeks. When neighbors asked about Elizabeth, he told them she was unwell, resting elsewhere. That elsewhere, it turned out, was the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Staunton, Virginia. Admission date, January 20th, 1848. Diagnosis, nervous exhaustion and delusions of persecution. The records from the asylum are cold, clinical, detached, but between the lines, something horrifying emerges. Elizabeth spoke of voices in the walls, of women watching her, of babies crying in the cellar. She told doctors her husband had turned against her, that he'd stolen her work, her fruits. Some nights she prayed for hours. Other nights, she refused to speak at all. Her hands trembled constantly, and she often whispered to them, as though they were the ones that had sinned. She would never leave the asylum alive. When restoration crews rebuilt the burned wing years later, they noticed something strange. The new windows had been placed unusually high, almost as if to keep anyone inside from seeing out. After the fire, Thomas sold 1/4 of the land. On paper, it was for financial recovery, though his records showed no loss of income. Historians believe the money wasn't used to rebuild. It was used to bury what was left behind in that east wing, and what had burned with it. Because Elizabeth hadn't gone mad overnight. She had simply broken under the weight of her own creation. 3 days before the fire, her journal, the one no one would discover for over a century, ended abruptly. The last line read, "The girls must understand their purpose here transcends their understanding." The girls. Margaret and Eleanor. Whatever Elizabeth planned for them, the fire stopped it. Or maybe, it only delayed it. More than a century passed before anyone spoke the name Elizabeth Harrington again. By the late 1960s, her estate had transformed from a private plantation into a museum piece, a relic of Virginia's genteel past. Tour guides praised the imported marble floors, the grand staircase, the symmetry of Georgian architecture. They spoke proudly of craftsmanship, never of chains. Then, in 1968, history decided it had been quiet long enough. A team of renovation workers began restoring the East Wing, the very section that had burned down in 1847. The job was simple: fix the foundation, repaint the cellar, prepare it for public tours. But when one worker swung his hammer against an old brick wall, he heard something hollow. Behind that wall, hidden for over a century, was a small room, 8 feet by 10, sealed off from the world. No windows. One door that locked from the outside. The air inside was still and wrong, heavy with the smell of rust and earth. On a table sat a tray of medical instruments, forceps, scalpels, glass jars labeled in delicate, looping handwriting. And next to them, wrapped in decaying cloth, was a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked with age. Its first page bore 2 initials, E.H. Much of the writing had been lost to water damage, but enough survived to reveal something more chilling than any ghost story. The entries weren't emotional. They were methodical, as if the author wasn't describing people at all, but subjects. Subject 7 has proven most productive. Subjects 3 and 9 continue to resist the process. Adjust diet. Increase supervision. Nowhere in the journal did the words woman or mother appear, only subject. The first scholar to examine it, Professor James Whittaker from the University of Virginia, wrote in his preliminary notes, "The tone of the journal suggests not mere cruelty, but calculation, a clinical system of reproductive exploitation. The author views herself as both scientist and overseer." He called it the Breeding Project. That same year, Whittaker's 40-page report was quietly sealed and archived. By 1969, it had been officially classified, locked away just like the room it came from. But rumors spread faster than any government order. Workers claimed they'd heard crying when no one else was in the cellar. One said he'd seen tiny handprints in the dust that hadn't been there the day before. The Historical Society brushed it off as superstition, patched the wall, and sealed the room again. Officially, the journal was labeled unverified. Unofficially, it was proof. Proof that the whispers about the locked rooms, the missing women, the doctor's visits, were not legend. They were ledger. And what lay inside those pages was only the beginning. Because scattered throughout Elizabeth's notes was a single word, underlined and capitalized every time she wrote it. When the fire consumed the East Wing, 2 little girls watched from the upstairs hallway, Margaret and Eleanor Harrington. They were 8 and 6 years old, clutching dolls while the only home they'd ever known glowed orange against the winter sky. They didn't understand what their mother had done. But they saw it, the smoke, the shouting, the locked doors, and their father's face pale with something between fear and relief. By spring of 1848, the family had vanished from Blackwood County. They moved into a narrow townhouse in Richmond, near St. Paul's Episcopal Church, a proper, respectable address for a man eager to rebuild his reputation. There, Thomas Harrington became a quiet fixture of the congregation, donating generously but avoiding conversation. Whenever someone asked about Elizabeth, he would lower his eyes and say softly, "Some matters are better left to God." The girls grew up under that silence like flowers deprived of sunlight. Well-mannered, studious, obedient, and far too serious for children. Their tutors praised their discipline. Their neighbors described them as angelic. But behind closed doors, the sisters rarely spoke above a whisper. They slept with lamps burning through the night. And they never laughed. When Elizabeth died in the asylum 4 years later, Thomas didn't attend her burial. He sent money. Nothing more. After her death, he forbade anyone, especially his daughters, from speaking her name again. But silence, like inheritance, passes down. As young women, Margaret and Eleanor became teachers at the Richmond Female Seminary. They were admired for their composure, respected for their intellect, and feared just a little for their severity. No one could recall either sister ever smiling. Their students remembered odd things. How Eleanor sometimes woke screaming in the night, claiming she heard women in the walls. How Margaret would sit motionless after evening prayers, whispering quietly as though answering someone no one else could hear. Neither ever married. Neither ever had children. When their father died in 1863, his will left them both a fortune, but with a peculiar condition. Under no inducement or inquiry shall my daughters return to the place of their birth. Why such a warning? What did Thomas fear, that the past might find them, or that they might go looking for it? Decades later, a letter from Eleanor surfaced. Written to a curious pupil researching her family history, it contained only one line that mattered. There are matters regarding one's ancestry best left unexplored. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. She died 6 years later, still a teacher, still unmarried, still haunted. Her final words, according to her housekeeper, were quiet but clear. Did they ever give them proper burials? No one knew who she meant. But perhaps she wasn't asking about graves in Richmond. She was remembering the women her mother had numbered, measured, and erased. the women whose cries had once echoed through the house where she was born. By the mid-20th century, the Harrington estate had become a story whispered more than studied, a name locals avoided, as though saying it aloud might wake something that preferred to sleep. The mansion stood immaculate, restored and admired by tourists who marveled at its beauty but never asked what built it. Then came Sarah Collins, a young historian from the University of Virginia. In the late 1950s, while researching plantation demographics, she stumbled across an anomaly in the state archives, a pattern of unusually high birth rates recorded at the Harrington plantation between 1840 and 1847. No new land expansions. No increase in crop output. Just births. For most researchers, it would have been a clerical curiosity. For Sarah, it became an obsession. She began piecing together a web no one else dared to connect: purchase records of enslaved girls, missing shipment manifests, and a doctor who had simply disappeared from the county's records. The more she uncovered, the more the pattern revealed itself. A deliberate system of reproduction as profit. In her private journal, dated 1963, she wrote, "What emerges is not mere cruelty, but system, a design of reproduction and wealth, conceived and executed by a woman. I believe Elizabeth Harrington was the architect of a deliberate breeding program." She was right. But she wouldn't live to publish it. Within a year, Sarah withdrew from her doctoral program, citing personal distress. Her friends said she'd grown paranoid, convinced she was being watched, that documents she'd read days earlier had suddenly been reclassified. She told one colleague that some histories are buried on purpose. Before she vanished from academia entirely, Sarah mailed one final letter to a friend. "I understand now why the Harrington daughters never spoke. Some knowledge changes you irrevocably. It's not the horror itself, but the realization that everyone around it, neighbors, churches, even the law, let it happen." Weeks later, she burned her research. Her notes would be rediscovered years later by Professor James Whittaker, the same historian who examined Elizabeth's journal after its discovery in 1968. He had no idea Sarah had already uncovered the same truth, and suffered for it. Whittaker's 40-page report was soon sealed by the Historical Society, marked sensitive material, restricted access. The official explanation claimed it was to preserve community integrity. But the unofficial reason was simpler: the truth threatened the genteel story Virginia preferred to tell about itself. Still, the truth has a way of clawing its way back to light. In 1977, construction crews digging 3 miles from the old estate unearthed 7 skeletons, all female, all between 15 and 25. Each showed signs of multiple pregnancies. County officials dismissed the find as unrelated. But the profile matched Elizabeth Harrington's records exactly. No markers were placed. No analysis followed. Just another burial, this time beneath bureaucracy. Because history, as Sarah once wrote, doesn't disappear. It's just filed away. Even now, the Harrington house still stands, golden brick, white columns gleaming under the Virginia sun. Tourists walk its halls every summer, admiring the spiral staircase and the chandelier imported from France. They take pictures on the porch where Elizabeth Harrington once greeted her guests, smiling in lace gloves and pearls. The guides talk about elegance, heritage, and the splendor of the Old South. But they never mention the cellar. They don't tell visitors that beneath those polished floors once stood a locked room. Or that in 1968, a hammer cracked through a wall and found the past waiting behind it, rusted, silent, and patient. It's easier to sell beauty than to confront horror. Easier to talk about craftsmanship than chains. When Professor Whittaker tried to publish his findings in the late 1960s, he received anonymous letters warning him to stop. His report was sealed. He died before it was ever reopened. Even today, portions of it remain redacted. But fragments survive, in university archives, in letters, and in the uneasy whispers of those who've seen what the official history refuses to show. Because the story of Elizabeth Harrington isn't just about one woman's cruelty. It's about a system that made her possible. A world where paperwork turned people into property, where a mother's body could become a factory floor, all in perfect accordance with the law. Nothing supernatural. Nothing illegal. And that's what makes it terrifying. The real haunting of the Harrington estate isn't ghosts in the halls. It's the silence. The careful, deliberate silence that erased the women who lived and died there, and then politely replaced them with words like heritage and tradition. In 1982, an elderly woman visited the restored mansion. She said her great-grandmother had been born there. The guide, not knowing the story, asked if she'd enjoyed her visit. The woman looked out toward the field where the women's quarters once stood. Her eyes lingered on the grass, the soft wind brushing over it like a hand smoothing a blanket. And then she said quietly, "No God I could believe in would let such a place exist." She left without giving her name. Maybe she was one of their descendants, one of the children Elizabeth sold, whose bloodlines carried through the generations, silent but unbroken. Maybe not. But in a way, it doesn't matter. Because what Elizabeth began in secret still echoes, not in screams, but in the stories people are too afraid to tell. They say that on quiet nights, when the wind drifts east across Blackwood County, you can still hear faint singing, lullabies without words, voices without names, rising from the place where the women's quarters once stood. Not ghosts. Just echoes. Echoes of a truth too long ignored. Echoes of mothers who never stopped calling for the children taken from them. Because the land remembers, even when people choose not to. And if you stand there long enough, you might hear it too. Soft as breath, carried through the centuries.